In this lesson, we're going to look specifically at the carbon cycle. Parts of our lesson include the science and engineering practices of developing and using models, using mathematics and computational thinking, constructing explanations and designing solutions, engaging in argument from evidence, as well as obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. Our cross-cutting concepts include cause and effect, scale, proportion, and quantity, systems and system models, energy and matter, and stability and change. Earth's systems. Carbon is a common element on our planet. It's found in the atmosphere, the geosphere, the biosphere, and the hydrosphere. Recall that we've already discussed what these terms mean. The atmosphere is all the gas that surrounds a planet or moon. The biosphere is all living things that exist on our planet. The geosphere is the rocky portion of our planet, and the hydrosphere is the water portion of our planet. Carbon is rarely found on its own. It's usually combined with other elements to form compounds. Carbon atoms can easily form bonds with other atoms because of their chemical structure. Any thoughts on why this is? Carbon is present in different compounds in each of Earth's systems. Carbon in Earth's systems. In the atmosphere, carbon is found combined with oxygen to form carbon dioxide. This is a gas. In the hydrosphere, carbon is found in dissolved carbon dioxide and other compounds. In the geosphere, carbon is found in fossil fuels and rocks such as limestone and chalk. And in the biosphere, carbon is found in living tissue. It's the building block in biological molecules. Specifically, carbon is found in carbohydrates, fats, as well as proteins. Movement of carbon. The amount of carbon on Earth always stays the same. No carbon atoms are created or destroyed. Instead, carbon moves between Earth's systems in a constant cycle called the carbon cycle. The rate at which carbon moves between parts of the cycle is very variable. Carbon can remain stored in a particular system for millions of years, or sometimes just a few days before moving to the next part of the cycle. Processes that move carbon. Carbon moves between Earth's systems in several ways. Photosynthesis, for example, is when carbon is moved from the atmosphere, or in some cases the hydrosphere, into the biosphere. Cellular respiration moves carbon from the biosphere to the atmosphere. Decomposition moves carbon from the biosphere into the atmosphere. Combustion moves carbon from the biosphere into the atmosphere. Sedimentation moves carbon from the biosphere and puts it in the geosphere. Volcanic activity takes it from the geosphere and puts it in the atmosphere. And then diffusion can take it from the atmosphere or the hydrosphere and put it into the hydrosphere or the atmosphere. Using energy from the sun, plants and algae combine carbon dioxide with water to make glucose. This process is known as photosynthesis. Here's a simple equation of photosynthesis, carbon dioxide plus water, in the presence of light and chlorophyll that's found in the chloroplasts of plants. Glucose is created, and the byproduct that is given off is oxygen. Glucose is a sugar that contains carbon. Plants use it to make other biological molecules, and this produces biomass. Carbon now has been stored in living tissues. Interactions with the hydrosphere. Much of the photosynthesis occurring on Earth takes place in the oceans. Around 70% of the oxygen in Earth's atmosphere comes from photosynthetic marine organisms, like algae. Phytoplankton are microscopic organisms, such as algae, that carry out photosynthesis. They're very common in parts of the oceans, and they form the start of many marine food chains. Cellular respiration. The biomass from photosynthetic organisms is eaten by other organisms. As a result, carbon passes through the food chain. Living organisms use cellular respiration to release energy from glucose. The equation for cellular respiration is as follows. Glucose plus oxygen gives off carbon dioxide and water. This process also releases energy. Carbon dioxide is released back into the atmosphere. So do all living organisms carry out cellular respiration using this equation? What do you think? Decomposition. When organisms die or produce waste, the biomass is broken down by organisms that feed on it. The digestion produces products that can then be absorbed and used for respiration. The process of breaking down dead matter is called decay or decomposition. All right, let's fill in some missing words. Photosynthesis is the process by which green plants and algae make what? In this case, it's glucose. And it's made from carbon dioxide and water, and it requires energy from the sun. In the plant, glucose can be converted to starch and stored in the plant, either used for growth or used to carry out what? In this case, it would be used to carry out cellular respiration. So plants first create glucose, and then they break it down through a process of cellular respiration to release energy. When plants respire, they release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. When plants are eaten, some of the carbon that they contain is transferred into the bodies of the animals that feed on them. The animals can then use it to make fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. When living organisms die, the carbon in their bodies is released back into the atmosphere through the process of decomposition. Let's talk about fossil fuels. Sometimes biomass from dead organisms is broken down. Sometimes it is not broken down. This can happen when dead matter is buried in sediments or submerged in water where there's a lack of oxygen. This prevents decomposition from occurring. Over time, pressure can cause the organic matter to form fossil fuels. Some examples of fossil fuels are coal, gas, or oil. Fossil fuels can store carbon underground for millions of years. So how do we play into this? Humans extract fossil fuels and burn them to release energy, and this process is called combustion. Combustion takes a fossil fuel plus oxygen to release carbon dioxide and water. Combustion releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. The combustion of fossil fuels releases carbon that has been stored in the geosphere for millions of years. Volcanoes also can release carbon back into the atmosphere. Carbon that is locked away in the geosphere can be released into the atmosphere through volcanic eruption. Temperatures in some parts of the Earth's crust and mantle are hot enough to melt the rocks that they contain. Volcanoes release molten rock and gases, including carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. Do you think that volcanoes or humans release more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere? Let's explore the process of the carbon cycle. Carbon is present in the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. Plants absorb atmospheric carbon dioxide when they photosynthesize. Plants use carbon to make new biomass, which is eaten by animals. Plants and animals release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere during respiration. Detritivores release carbon dioxide as they consume dead and decaying matter. Sediments from dead matter form fossil fuels and carbon-based rocks. Burning fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And volcanoes can release carbon dioxide from the Earth's core into the atmosphere as well. All right, let's label the carbon cycle. Combustion by human activities leads to atmospheric CO2. Photosynthesis takes that atmospheric CO2 and makes it into usable forms where organisms can then eat it. Sedimentation is when that CO2 is deposited and creates sediments, which then can be taken out and used by people. Respiration releases the carbon that is stored in other organisms. Diffusion of carbon dioxide into ocean water can occur. Carbon dioxide is soluble in water. Can you think of any common examples that show this? Carbon dioxide can dissolve into Earth's oceans. When there's a difference between the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and in the ocean, the gas moves by diffusion to areas of lower concentration. This means that carbon can be exchanged in both directions between the ocean and the atmosphere. Interaction with the biosphere. Carbon dioxide in the ocean will remain there as a dissolved gas. However, some of it is used in other chemical processes. Dissolved carbon dioxide can react with water to form carbonic acid, H2CO3. Carbonic acid breaks down to form other chemicals. Organisms that live in the ocean can use these to build their shells or hard parts. This then moves dissolved carbon into the biosphere. Interaction with the geosphere. When marine organisms die, their hard parts can fall into the ocean floor and accumulate over time. Over millions of years, layers of these hard parts can become cemented together, forming rocks such as limestone and chalk. These are known as sedimentary rocks, or also carbonate rocks. Carbonate rocks can store carbon in the geosphere for millions of years. Let's summarize the carbon cycle. Looking at our image here, we've got atmospheric carbon dioxide, dead organic matter, and fossil fuels. So what do each of the arrows represent for the entire carbon cycle? Well, if we've got atmospheric carbon dioxide going into, it looks like some algae or some phytoplankton inside the water, this is going to be diffusion. Going right into those organisms and being used to convert carbon dioxide into glucose, that process would be photosynthesis. So diffusion is the absorption of carbon dioxide by the water itself. Photosynthesis is going to be the absorption of carbon dioxide for the creation of glucose. As these things die, sedimentation can occur. We can also get some fossilization, where organisms die and are buried and they're turned into fossil fuels. Decomposition can occur, both of dead organisms and also of the waste that they produce. When this organic matter returns to the atmosphere, it's respiration. And respiration would be found here with living things as well. So this respiration would be related to bacteria and decomposition. And photosynthesis, of course, is when atmospheric carbon dioxide is taken in by plants on the surface. All right, so let's look to see what absorbs and releases carbon dioxide. We've got some terms that we're going to work with here. Combustion. Is it going to absorb atmospheric carbon, or is it going to release? It is going to release atmospheric carbon dioxide. Anaerobic respiration, so this is without oxygen, but still respiration. Photosynthesis is going to absorb carbon. Formation of carbonic acid, so this is where water is absorbing carbon dioxide. Aerobic respiration, using oxygen, breaking down carbon. Fossilization, this is going to be storing carbon over long periods of time, so let's say absorbs. And let's check our answer. Looks like we had everything correct. How much carbon? Carbon dioxide only makes up about 0.041% of our atmosphere. However, this small percentage holds over 800 billion tons of carbon. The oceans hold much more, around 40 billion tons of carbon. Excuse me, 40,000 billion tons of carbon. So there's a big difference there. These numbers are so large that they're difficult to visualize. So how might you go about making that easier to understand? Well, we might put it into a model. Here's the global yearly flow of carbon in gigatons of carbon. So our atmosphere, putting it into the oceans. Let's first start by looking at how many gigatons exist in each one of these reservoirs. There we've got our gigatons on there. Well, if our atmosphere is 800 gigatons and our oceans are 40,600 gigatons, we're going to add 100 gigatons yearly, and we're going to lose 97 gigatons yearly. So each year there is a difference of 3 gigatons being added to the oceans. Atmospheric, not really adding very much in the form of fossil fuels. However, our fossil fuels are adding 6.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, or carbon in general to the atmosphere, every single year. So there's a big offset there. 0 from the atmosphere being added to fossil fuels, but 6.5 gigatons being added back to the atmosphere. All right, plants. Plants is less than 100 gigatons being added to the atmosphere. And we have around 100 gigatons being added back to the plants and to soil from the atmosphere. So we're offset a little bit here. So our big discrepancy ends up being in this area right here, our use of fossil fuels. Changes to the carbon cycle. Over time, the balance of carbon in Earth's systems has changed. This means that the atmosphere, oceans, biosphere, and geosphere may contain more or less carbon than they do today. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased over the last few hundred years. The rate of this increase is greater than would be expected as a result of just natural processes. So what could it be? As we look at the amount of carbon concentrations in the atmosphere over time, starting 450,000 years before the present, and we've come to these conclusions by studying Antarctic ice cores to find out how CO2 concentrations have changed over thousands of years. This is what we've seen. The graph shows the changes in CO2 concentration in the atmosphere over the last 400,000 years. Now looking at the data that we've collected since the 1860s. This graph shows CO2 levels from 1861 to 2003, and we're noticing a substantial increase. What could have caused this increase in CO2 levels since the 1800s? Changes caused by humans would be the majority of those changes that we've seen in the last 200 years. Since the Industrial Revolution, human activities have added over 1,000 billion tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Where's the majority of this come from? It's come from a lot of burning of fossil fuels. The oceans have absorbed around 50% of the carbon that we've released. Much of the rest is contributed to the increase in atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide. So what is the impact of an increased CO2 in the atmosphere? What effect do you think an increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide will have on our planet? Remember, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. The increase in enhancing the greenhouse effect causes Earth to trap more of the radiation from the sun that we receive. This has the potential of changing climates. The increased amount of carbon dioxide in the ocean has led to noticeable changes today. As we increase carbon dioxide concentrations in the ocean, we produce carbonic acid. The oceans are measurably changing in their acidity. They are becoming more and more acidic. This causes the hard parts of many marine organisms that are made of things like carbonates, which can easily dissolve in an acidic ocean, to break down. So thinking about this, processing it, describe and explain the parts of the carbon cycle involved in the image of a fishing boat. You can refer to the movement of carbon between Earth systems, support your work with your own research, and present your ideas. Thinking about things like running the engine and where the material comes from that we're using to run the engine. This is the end of our lesson. I hope that it was helpful.